Chapter 7. A Time of Dying. The following week, the Gaga finally ran out in the trading center. People began living on pumpkin leaves, and when that was gone, they sifted through the garbage for banana peels and old corn cobs. Along our road, they dug up tree roots and ate grass, anything to fill their stomachs. As starvation set in, their bodies began to change. Some people became so thin they looked like walking skeletons. Others came down with kwashiorkor, a condition caused by the lack of protein. Instead of shriveling like everyone else, their arms, legs, and bellies swelled with fluid and became fat. It was another of the famine's cruel jokes. The reality was that they were dying. Every day the starving people stopped by our house and begged my father for help. They saw we had iron sheets on one part of our house and thought we were rich, even though they were fastened by stones. Some of the men said they'd walked 30 miles. "If you have one biscuit, please, I can work," they begged, their bare feet so swollen they couldn't wear sandals. "We're now 6 days without eating. If you have just a small plate of nsima." "I have nothing," my father insisted. "I'm barely feeding my own family." "Just give us porridge," they demanded. I said no. A few men were too weak to continue and slept in our yard all night. The ground and wood were too wet for fires, and when the rains came in the darkness, they curled up under our porch and shivered. By morning, they were gone. A few nights later, we were sitting outside having our meal when a man approached from the road. He was covered in mud and so thin, it was hard to understand how he was even alive. His teeth protruded from his shriveled mouth and his hair was falling out. Without saying hello, he sat down beside us. Then, to my horror, he reached his dirty hand into our bowl and ripped off a giant piece of nsima. We sat there in shock, saying nothing as he closed his eyes and chewed. He swallowed deep and satisfyingly, and when the mouthful was safely in his stomach, he turned to my father. "Do you have more?" "I'm sorry," my father said. "Okay then," the man replied, stood up, and walked away. The crowds continued to pour in from the bush. More than ever, they converged in the trading center like herds of crazed animals driven together by fire. Women with gaunt, ashen faces sat alone, pleading with God. But they did it quietly and without tears. Anguish was expressed mostly in silence, since few had the energy to cry. Some traders still spread their tops in the mud and sold grain, but the units had become smaller and smaller. Its price was like gold, like buying the universe and stars in 1/2 kilo. Crowds gathered around, but mostly to stare in stunned amazement, as if watching a dream in heaven. Those with energy used it to scream and beg so their families might live. "Bwana! Just a small plate of flour for my child. That's all I need. It's for my child." If I start with you," the traders answered, then said nothing at all. The ones with energy edged closer, lunging like a wolf pack whenever a kernel fell to the ground, shoveling gravel and all into their mouths. Each group told a different story of the dead. "There was the man who'd spent days looking for food," one man said. "One morning, he decided to nap under a tree and never woke up." "I was cooking," said another, "when a man came and sat down. He said he needed to eat, but before the nsima was ready, he too was dead." Others had gone so many days without eating, the first bellyful of food sent their bodies into fatal shock. One woman stepped over 2 dead men on the road, still pitifully clutching their hoes. Men whose legs had swollen with kwashiorkor tried to drain their giant blisters with a knife, only to die later from infection. The people on the roads weren't the only ones wasting away. One night in early February, I sat down to eat my small portion of nsima and noticed Kamba standing in the open door. His head hung low and his eyes drooped, and by the lantern light, I could count each rib pressing beneath his skin. The walk across the courtyard had exhausted him. Like so many others in Wimbe, my dog was starving to death. His last big meal had been the Christmas goat skin, which had given him strength and even added a little weight. But since then, I'd managed to feed him only 5 times, just a small handful of nsima and little more. I had nothing to give him tonight. "Sorry, friend," I said, and felt a lump swell in my throat. "I just can't share." It didn't take me long to eat. When the food was gone and out of sight, I stepped over Kamba and went to my room. I lay down in bed and fell into a strange, fitful sleep. That night, I dreamed that my stomach had taken over my entire body, filling up my arms, legs, and head like a great big balloon. But at some point in the dream, it had popped and left only emptiness. It turned out my stomach had only been filled with air. Now it was shriveled and useless and howled in anguish. I took deep breaths to try and fill it again, but it was no use. My whole body ached. I have to eat, I thought. I lay there listening to the rain on my roof, then gathered the strength to move. I got out of bed and made my way outside. I stopped at the kitchen door and peeked in. Kamba was curled up by the fire, which had long lost its heat. "Kamba," I shouted, "let's go hunting." The very word made him shoot upright, as if he'd been shocked. He slapped his tail against the floor and struggled to his feet. It had been a year since I'd said those words to him, and still he was ready. In fact, his tail swung so hard I thought it would knock him back over. "Let's get some food, boy." I had no maize or gaga for my trap, so I grabbed a handful of ash from the fire pit and threw it into a sugar bag. We set off down the trail toward the Dowa Highlands, which seemed forever draped in turmoil. We walked slowly to conserve energy, and I whistled a happy tune to raise our spirits. The maize in our fields was growing tall and green, and I knew it wouldn't be long until we could eat. Maybe a month, perhaps a bit longer. Soon this darkness would lift. I looked across the sky for birds, but saw none. At the trap site, I fastened the rubber to the poles and set the trigger. I sprinkled the ash along the ground and sighed. It looked pathetic. "Let's hope these birds are as hungry as we are," I said. If we could get 3 birds, perhaps tonight, I could sleep better. Perhaps Kamba could gain some strength and hang on for another week. I took the rope and dragged it behind a nearby tree, where the dog and I stretched out and waited. He immediately fell asleep. 15 minutes later, a small flock of birds swooped down and landed beside the trap. Kamba's head shot up, as if he'd seen them in his dreams. As they hopped toward the kill zone, I let my imagination wander. I pictured the warm fire in the courtyard, felt my hands rubbing the salt into the meat, then hanging the pieces over the embers. I heard the sizzle and breathed in the rich aroma. The sudden pounding of my heart snapped me out of my daydream, just in time to see the birds approach the bait. I was about to pull the rope when they realized it was only ash and flew away in a burst of wings. I exhaled in defeat. I may have even cried. That night back at home, Kamba fell into a deep, scary slumber. I had a difficult time waking him, even with some nsima and pumpkin leaves I'd saved from dinner. "Kamba!" I shouted. "Supper!" He opened his eyes and gave me a slap of his tail. I tossed the food into the air, but he made no effort, and it landed with a thud on the ground. Several minutes passed before he could lift himself to eat. His body quivered when he swallowed. 2 days later, I fed him again. It was only some pumpkin leaves, so I walked over and spooned them into his bowl. "I wish it was more," I said, "but it's all I can manage." But as soon as the food hit Kamba's stomach, he vomited it back up. I knew the end was near. "Just wait 1 month. We'll be feasting in a month." The next morning, my cousin Charity stopped by the house. He was with his friend Mizek, whom I didn't recognize at first. Mizek had always been a big guy, a real bruiser, but now I could see the skull in his face. When he saw Kamba, his voice got a bit crazy. "Look at this thing," he said. "This dog's pathetic." Kamba was half asleep, unmoved by the flies nesting on his coat. He'd long stopped caring. "I can't even stand to look at it," he said. I tried changing the subject. "So what are you chaps doing today?" I said. "Going to the trading center as usual," Charity replied. "Perhaps we'll find some ganyu, but I'm not so hopeful." While Charity and I talked, Mizek kept his eyes on Kamba, like he was obsessed. He said, "You need to put this thing out of its misery. Take it behind the house and use a big stone." I pretended not to hear him. "He's right, William," Charity said. "Can't you see the dog is suffering? Take him to the dambo where the water is high. It will be painless." "Wait a minute," I said, stammering. "What are you guys saying?" "We're saying it's time to be a man," said Mizek. I wanted to smash his face. "My dog is fine," I said. "He's going to get better. In just a month, we'll be—" "If you can't do it yourself," Mizek snapped, "then we'll do it for you." I looked at Charity, who then lowered his voice. "It's the right thing to do, William. Don't worry, you don't even have to bother. We'll stop by tomorrow and take him. He won't feel a thing." I struggled to find words, some form of protest, but Mizek's crazy eyes stole my breath. They were yellow like a bitten hyena. When Mizek and Charity finally left, I felt dizzy and weak, as if my legs were made of grass. I sat down beside Kamba and watched him sleep. The flies circled and landed, circled and landed. I must have been there half an hour before he finally opened his eyes and saw me, then gave a slow flip of the tail. The way he looked at me, even in this state, made me remember our days together, how we could talk without even speaking. I decided then I couldn't let Mizek and Charity take him. I considered my options until the compound grew dark, then finally had my answer. They were right about Kamba. He was suffering. But they were wrong about me. I could be a man. The next morning, I was sitting with Kamba when Charity appeared in the courtyard. My pulse quickened. He looked at the dog and started toward us, but before he could say anything, I stood up. "I'm taking him," I said. "What?" "I'm taking him to the forest." He looked confused. "A stone is very quick," he said. "So is the dambo." "This is what I want." Charity nodded. "It's the right thing to do. We'll do it together, today." That afternoon, when Charity returned, we walked to the shady place behind my room where Kamba slept. He hadn't moved since the previous night. "Kamba," I said. "Let's go hunting." His head perked up. "I said let's go." He staggered to his feet. shook once to loosen the flies, and hobbled toward me. It took us ages to get out of the compound. I had to walk backward in front of him to keep him moving. "Come on, boy, you can do it." We walked down the road toward the highlands. The sun was sinking in the west and colored the hills in a tangerine glow. The air felt warm and dry. It was the perfect weather for hunting. We entered the blue gum groves that Kamba knew so well. At one point, Charity turned off the trail and said, "This way." Kamba and I followed, struggling through the high grass. The tears were hot in my throat, but I swallowed them down. Charity looked at me. "Don't be upset," he said. "It's just a dog." I nodded. "Yeah, just a dog." After several minutes, we stopped where the brush was thick and the grass reached our chests. The mountains were visible over the blue gums. "This is a good place," Charity said. "No one will pass here." It didn't feel right. Sure enough, turning around, I could still see the top of my house. "This is too close," I said. "This dog can't go any further." I looked over at Kamba. He'd collapsed in the tall grass under a tambozi tree and was panting heavily. Without a word, Charity started stripping bark from a kachiri tree to make a long rope. I turned my back and stared into the forest. When his hands went quiet, I knew it was ready. "Tie him to the tree," I said. Charity lashed the rope to the trunk of the tambozi, then tied the other end to the dog's leg. Once the knot was fastened, he turned and walked away. When I followed, Kamba raised his head and began to whine. He knew I was leaving him. After a few steps down the trail, I made the enormous mistake of turning to look. His eyes were still on me. Then he laid down his head. "I did a terrible thing," I said, then walked faster through the trees. Once we reached the compound, Charity went home, and I walked toward my room. Along the way, I passed Kamba's food bowl sitting by the hen house. I picked it up and hurled it against the ground, shattering it to pieces. It's just a dog, I thought. I stayed awake long into the night, knowing that Kamba was just down the hill. If I screamed his name loud enough, I thought, he could probably hear me. The next day, I avoided everyone and stayed busy in the fields. But once I got home that afternoon, Socrates was there visiting my father. "Have you seen Kamba?" he asked. "I can't find him anywhere." "I haven't seen him," I said. Well, I hope those wild dogs didn't get him." "Yeah," I replied. "Me too." That night I tried to force Kamba out of my mind, but I kept seeing him in the tall grass. The image never stayed long, for I was too hungry to concentrate on anything. The next morning, Charity found me in my room. "Let's go see what happened to Kamba," he said. "What do you mean?" "Let's go see if he's dead." He carried a hoe in his hand and told me to grab mine. "We'll bring them so people will think we're going to the fields. That way we can bury him." We set off with our tools, but I was too mixed up for conversation. We turned off the trail and into the bush, where the grass was still wet from the morning dew and soaked my trousers. After a while, I saw a white hump on the ground. "Look," Charity said. "Is he dead?" We walked closer. Kamba was in the same position as when we'd left him. His head rested on his front paws, and his eyes were wide open. I gasped, expecting him to move. Then I saw his tongue sticking out. It was dry like paper and covered with ants. Kamba is dead, I said. The rope hadn't budged. There'd been no struggle. A terrible thought seized me. After Kamba watched me go, he'd surrendered his will to live, which meant that I'd killed him. While Charity untied the rope, I started digging the hole. A furious energy came over me, and I worked faster than I had in months. When the grave was ready, Charity and I pushed Kamba's body inside, then paused. "So long, Kamba," I said. "You're a good friend." We filled the grave with soil and left no marker. We even concealed the freshly dug earth with grass and leaves. When Charity and I returned home, we told no one about what we'd done. It's remained a secret all these years, until now.